Okay, today I'm going to talk about the experiments from the 1970s, 80s mostly on teaching chimpanzees, but mostly these experiments are about teaching chimpanzees ASL, or American Sign Language, which professional linguistic associations agree is a real language. Um, Going into that then, I mean, it's a controversial question, this question about the mental lives of other animals besides human beings. Um, So what I would urge is to approach this particular presentation on that topic, not so much by way of deciding whether you think animals have minds or don't have minds. I mean, by this point in our class, you should get it that it's really not conceptually all that clear what it really means to even say what a mind is, or, I mean, what we're here to do is conceptual analysis. So what I want to do, what I'm going to do in this video today is explain to you the theoretical context and the things that the people are arguing about. So, I mean, dimly in the popular consciousness, we have, they tried to teach Ape Sign Language and then what happened. Um, but actually there was a great deal of theoretical framework already in place when these experiments started to happen. Experiments, I don't know if I call them what I call them. We're going to take a look at them. Anyway, um, we can call this the Great Ape Language Controversy. I love this picture. This is actually a female gorilla. This is Coco the gorilla, who was on the cover of National Geographic with her pet kitten, and it's a famous picture. And this is quite a striking picture because it's such a good picture of Coco. I'm not actually going to talk about what they did with Coco the gorilla, but Coco was extremely good at sorting out photographs depending on what was in them and sorting them out by category and so on. So, when you're answering those security things on social media and it says click on every frame that has a street light in it or something like that, and Coco could sort out dozens and dozens of different categories of things and sets within sets of things as well, all of the plants and all of the tools and all of the food and so on. So that's another thing that the research that I'm going to talk about today has to do with, this ability to categorize. And one of the things we're not going to get into today, by the way, is what's been shown with non-primates, although we are going to talk about some monkeys technically. All right. So the ape language controversy, a struggle between cognitivism and behaviorism. And typically you'll get a sort of story about the big bad behaviorists. But I think when we look at the ape language controversy, that's one place where you'll see that that's, they're not, the behaviorists are not obviously the villains in the scenario. I mean, I'm not saying that the cognitivists are the villains either. Again, if you're one of my students, what you really want to be doing right now is figuring out what behaviorism and cognitivism are and what kind of theoretical disputes they have between them and why that would pertain to the question of the mental lives of non-linguistic animals. So going on with that a little bit, coming into the 20th century, you start to get in the 1920s a sort of behavioristic movement. Now it's part of this sort of empiricist psychology, and we've already been talking about that. Behaviorism in its sort of United States 1920s, 1930s incarnation, and John Watson and B.F. Skinner and all that, is one example of a community that was using an empiricist or operationalist approach to psychology. But it's an old thing, and one of the things that we've looked at already is William James. And we saw that William James also had sort of, why operationalist when you're talking about something that's observable or empirical? Why say operationalist? Because the operation is that law of effect, right? That positive and negative building up of an organization that's not there in the first place. So now there was a great culture war in the first part of the 20th century about behaviorism, because people understood behaviorism to be saying that there sort of really weren't any, look, you could look at it two ways. You could say, well, behaviorists are claiming that there aren't really any minds or mental experiences. But slow down, that would be obviously wrong. Why would that be obviously wrong? Well, because behaviorists are people like you and I, and here we sit. And, there aren't any magic words or theories that sort of, in a sense, like the philosopher says, philosophy changes nothing. The question is to have a theory about the way things go right now, not a question of trying to change anything. Behaviorists were never trying to change the way people looked at the mind. They were trying to understand the mind as we experience the mind, just like everybody else. They're not crazy. So we can dispense with, a facile popular impression that behaviorists think that people are zombies, since they're not any more zombies than you or I. A corollary of that, of course, is you can come to understand and appreciate the good parts of empiricist psychology, like behaviorism, without zombifying yourself. It's really perfectly safe. Um, but we had great controversy there. And to be fair, I mean, because so far I've just set up a straw man about the people who are attacking behaviorism, but behaviorism as taking itself as a science. Remember, in a nutshell, what is behaviorism? Behaviorism really is saying that you can have a scientific psychology if you stick to empirical methodology. You have to follow the methodology, and then ipso facto, it'll be scientific. And that's the strategy of behaviorism. And I think a success of behaviorism, in one level anyway, was managing to give an account of the semantics of psychological descriptions that didn't refer to any unobservable things. I mean, how successful overall as a psychology it was. Well, that's one of the things we're talking about, I guess, on this slide. So I mentioned there in the second point, Aldous Huxley in 1932 novel Brave New World. In Brave New World, because what I was getting at before, the idea of science was in prediction and control. I mean, that's getting back to a kind of Roger Bacon-y kind of, notion of science. That that scientific propositions, if they are good, and again, think of William James, should give you sort of prediction and control of things. And so people understood that, reasonably enough, thought that didn't sound that great because that looks like a technology to control people. Behaviorism, positive and negative reinforcement, operate in classical conditioning. We can engineer people's behaviors. Brave New World, the title of Aldous Huxley's novel, comes from The Tempest by William Shakespeare. Brave New World that has such people in it, she says, seeing them for the first time. In Brave New World, then, they take the working class babies, and when they crawl towards the flowers, they give them an electric shock. And when they crawl towards the tools, they give them a reward until they want the rewards and the tools and not the flowers, because they're just engineering them to be working class babies. And in A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, they take the juvenile delinquents and cause them to become nauseated when they listen to classical music by playing horrible images of things while they're listening to classical music. So the idea is that then behaviorism, there are two problems with behaviorism. There's a theoretical problem in as much as it's taken to be a very diminishing kind of psychological view that denies your sort of inner life. I think that's incorrect and based on a misconception of what's going on with empiricism and philosophy of psychology. But the second point is also a real one, which is that it looked like behaviorism, so enthusiastic about being one of these sciences and clearly a technology of control and touting itself as such, then got pushback from people who found those ideas to be threatening ideas. Now, just again, the last bullet point on the slide, I won't linger there long, but you could have said that you might have said that we're misinterpreting. One thing you could do is say, well, people are misinterpreting behaviorism, and properly interpreted is getting at some points about psychology that are really important and that are universal points about humans and about non-human animals. And I actually think that's sort of right. you could also say, look, behaviorism doesn't work for humans or non-human animals or non-linguistic animals. And many people would argue for that as well. Slightly odder to split the difference. I mean, you could, the way the difference is split right now is to say that, well, with animals, they really do come under a kind of behavioristic paradigm in terms of how their psychology works, but humans don't. So behaviorism works for animals, doesn't work for humans. I mean, if I had to choose, I'd actually kind of say that humans with their plasticity and learning and general sort of negatory powers are the ones you might want to approach more operationally. It's in the sense of what you see is what you get, and you can also affect it through interaction. So it seems to me that if we're going to be behaviorists about one side of the human non-human divide and cognitivists about the other, we ought to be cognitivists about the animals and behaviorists about the people. Well, that's just an opinion. As I say, really, I think that not necessarily classical behaviorism, but some of the operationalist principles that are reflected in empirical psychology actually are right. It was a mistake to forsake them as completely as they did. But anyway, we are talking, the title of this slide is Some Politics. So we're looking at sort of the theoretical politics. What's happening here? Well, Noam Chomsky in the 1950s, first he publishes an article. It's a book review of B.F. Skinner's, I think his book on language, not verbal behavior. Yeah, Skinner tried to show a behaviorist account of language. Remember Jean Piaget at this time, around these decades, I think 1940s, 1950s, is showing that human children acquire language at regular stages, at regular predictable stages. And so this is also noticed, this kind of nativist movement, as well as sort of, say, Konrad Lorenz working on imprinting on baby ducks, and that kind of stuff is also pushing against behaviorism, right? That it's the idea that when you say nativist, the idea that there are innate things. Chomsky is a nativist. He thinks quite sensibly, and he's certainly not incorrect, that the human genome contains instructions such that as the human animal flourishes and develops, it comes to speak in the same way that birds come to have wings and fish come to have gills, and that's right. So so then the question is, well, do you have to be a linguistic animal like a human being in order to what exactly? Because we've been throwing around things like minds and stuff. Let's step out here a second. What exactly is the claim? So the question is, I have in my psychological vocabulary these words like belief, desire, hope, fear, expectation, suspicion, intention, and other words like that. And we call those words the intentional vocabulary. So notice that you have a belief that something, a desire, this is the argument, right? A desire for something, and so on. For what? And then the idea is that that's going to have some content. You're going to have some way of representing what it is that your belief is a belief about, or your hope is a hope about. Okay, so so precisely then the question is this: when I am using intentional psychology, what does that mean? Anything fancy? No. It just means that my dog is there, and I'm talking about my dog, and I'm talking about my dog in terms of my dog's beliefs and desires and hopes and fears and so on. As of course I do, and so do you about your dog too. And so I'm doing that. And the question is, when I'm doing that, am I actually referring, remember the semantics of psychological words. What does the word refer to? Here you have a word belief. I say that I have a belief. I say that my dog has a belief. Do I mean the same thing? I say yes, but this kind of Chomskyan cognitivism says no to that. And so that's what we want to see. So again, now we're not talking about do animals have, just to recap, and then we'll go back to the slide, not talking about do animals have minds, which is very vague, but we haven't defined the concept of mind very well. I'm not sure that we can. But now we've got something more specific. That is, when we make intentional descriptions of non-human animals, what are those? Those are descriptions that use words like belief, desire, hope, fear, and so on. Do we mean the same thing as we do when we make those descriptions of human beings? You know, even now, notice that I have to have some sort of public way for us to be thinking about this, right? You say, well, do the animals have minds? Well, do you have a mind? Do I have a mind? What does it even mean? What I'm saying is, it looks to me like when I say the dog has a belief and when I say the person has a belief, I mean the same. I think I'm referring to the same things. And the Chomskyan linguist says no. So that's what we want to understand. Okay, so let's go back then to the slides. I just wanted to clear up that thing about minds. So how the animals lost their minds, because if you look at people like Darwin or Romanes, one of his colleagues at the end of the 19th century, and they write about the expression of emotion in man and animals. That's the title of Darwin's book about it. And writing there in the 1880s, 1890s, those scholars just think that what dogs are proud and ashamed, and I mean they just routinely make the same kind of mental attributions to, say, dogs, they're into dogs, as they do to humans. So it's in this behaviorist movement in the 1920s, 1930s when you can say that the animals lost their minds. There's a writer named Bernard Rollins, I believe is at Colorado State, who has an article from a long time ago called How the Animals Lost Their Minds. Important. So Chomsky then, so keeping our eye on the ball here, Chomsky, remember, is worried about what he sees as the kind of dehumanizing effects of a behaviorist view of the human mind. So he wants to forestall that. And so he says, look, whereas non-linguistic animals are only instinctual, they only make what you call tropic calls. What does that mean? Those are just innate calls that are just made automatically given the right environmental circumstances. And similarly, their behaviors. People used to believe this actually a lot more than they do now. When I was in school back in the 70s, a lot of people started to talk about animal behavior and say, oh, instinct. You really don't hear people using the word instinct as much anymore. But anyway, that's just an observation. So remember, how does it go then? Chomsky says you've got a grammatical structure. The blank is blank, the blank. You've got all those pronouns and adverbs and so on, and that's generative grammar. So instead of just having a set repertoire of calls that are sort of in your genetic code, in the case of humans, since they have a grammatical structure that can be used to form an indefinitely large number. And in fact, when you think about recursion, like I'm thinking, you can show that it could be used to generate an infinite number of propositions, and those propositions are the contents of these intentional states, the beliefs and desires and so on, the things that the beliefs and the desires and so on are about. So if that's right, then a non-linguistic animal that can't form a grammatically well-formed proposition can't be said to have any mental content, because that's what mental content is, or that is, the formal structure of mental content is linguistic. It's propositional in structure. It's grammatical. Formal, you call that. So cognitivism. Remember, behaviorism, then we're pretty clear on what that is at this point, right? Behaviorism saying that, well, it's got to be intersubjectively observable dispositions to behave, or other intersubjectively observable things and effects that over which I can quantify roughly. Cognitivism, in even vaguer definition, really, because cognitivism wants to study the structure of cognition. You can think of it in terms of the software of the mind. That's important. That's the relationship between cognitivism and the computer age and all AI and all that. Cognitive studies wanting to have functional rather than physical descriptions of things. And so a formal study, and that's a study, cognitive psychologists will do things like have subjects memorize series of digits and see how the memory is good and falls off at the ends of so many numbers and that kind of stuff. Looking at then again, the structure of the program, sort of what are the rules that the mind follows. That's sort of cognitivism. And many people hold that cognitivism kind of replaced or pushed out behaviorism, although out there in the experimental psychology world, that's kind of actually far from true. But what I'm trying to suggest, I'm certainly not alone in this, is that these theoretical arguments are also far from over. So how the animals lost their minds. So what happens? Well, you have, sort of, no one's thinking there's some sort of radical disjunct between animals and non-human animals. You come into the 20th century, you get behaviorism. That's meant to cover both human and non-human animals. In fact, and I'll get back to that, that's an important thing about behaviorism. But then the linguists say, well, yeah, but not for human beings. They don't come under that behaviorist description. Everything comes under the law of effect description, that positive outcomes reinforce and negative outcomes extinguish. And that includes human beings, and you can't turn it off and you can't get away. But anyway, on to the next. So now then the Great Ape Language. So now we've set up this context where we can understand what was going on when these people started to teach chimpanzee sign language. They started in the 1960s, and the work started to get published and widely discussed in the 70s. The work I'm talking about today goes on into the 1980s. So a couple things then. For one thing, a lot was at stake at this. I mean, not just sort of people's kind of off the cuff prejudices about whether animals have minds or not. If behaviorism was right, I mean, the appeal of behaviorism coming down from Hume, as I say, coming down through this empiricist tradition, was that you would have general psychological laws. Hume said, look, children and non-linguistic animals, Hume says in the treatise, he says they clearly also have minds. They also clearly think and feel. So he says in the treatise, which he published in the 1730s, he says, look, any psychological theory is going to have to be a psychological theory that explains young children and non-human animals, because they obviously do have whatever it is that we're calling a mind, and Hume understood that. But Chomsky, says that there's discontinuity between humans and other animals. Again, Chomsky's a rationalist, and on the other side of the empiricist. My sympathies are empiricist. Oh, and then there's all this politics with Chomsky all the time. So you're like, oh, is this guy some kind of right-wing guy? Then he says he doesn't like Chomsky. No, not at all. I'm fine with Chomsky that way, although he is always really political, even when he's claiming to be scientific. I will say that. But anyway, so you have John and Beatrix Gardner, and they're very, forward-minded people. They want to appreciate animals. I mean, they're not like, people get backwards who's who, and they start raising this chimpanzee, and they're going to teach the chimpanzee American Sign Language, because and in this I wouldn't get on the boat with them. I mean, what they want to say, that the hardcore view at this point is to say that, look, language is learned. Humans are really smart and they can learn it really well, but it's learned because everything's learned. All behavior's learned. And it's got a unrealistically sort of plastic picture of the human mind not paying enough attention to the real innatist structure that is there. Steven Pinker gets a lot of mileage out of this, although he's on the wrong side of animal mind as well. So they teach Washoe American Sign Language. As I mentioned, American Sign Language is a real language. Linguists study it as a language. And Washoe had great success of 350 signs, and putting the signs together. And this was all taped and then recorded. I mean, these are scientists trying very hard. They're not just sort of hanging out with the animal. They're filming this, and then they go back and they do the transcripts, and they look at, which words were used together and what order they were put in and that kind of stuff. And they keep close notes of all this, because what they want is to see Washoe learning grammatical rules. Because if they do, that's evidence disconfirming the Chomskyan claim that language is innate. Again, it's a little bit wrong-headed to me. I mean, it looks as if obviously, language is something unique to humans in a natural environment. So, but anyway, that's what they're doing. So again, the people, keeping our eye on the ball, right? The people teaching the chimpanzee the sign language are the behaviorists, because the behaviorists want to show that that language is a learned thing, and they want to minimize the innate genetic causes of language. Whereas the nativists, the rationalist side of things, want to say, they want to go pretty far in the other direction and say that the non-linguistic animals really can't be said to have thoughts at all, because what thoughts are just linguistic structures. Linguistic objects are propositions, sentences are the contents of intentional states. So Washoe does all right with this, and Washoe puts together words in the way you would expect, tending to repeat words a lot: out, 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 Washoe, go, out, go, Washoe, that kind of stuff. It's a lot of that kind of stuff. So one thing that Washoe would do would be, of course, obviously, to repeat the words, clearly putting together 2, 3, 4 words at a time in coherent ways, obviously enough with what the animal is trying to communicate to you. At the time, and this got a lot of attention too, because the gardeners moved this chimpanzee baby into their house. I think it was in like Maryland or someplace. And they raised it in their house, and they, like a human. In retrospect, it probably was all pretty unnecessary, but I mean, they were trying to control for the possibility that they thought anyway, that the child is hearing the adults speak. The child listening to the adults speak acquires language. The behaviorist is going to think it's adults speaking, and the behaviorist is going to point to people who have linguistic psychopathies because of, say, behavioral or stimulatory deprivation, sensory deprivation, or lack of access to language. Herbert Terrace had a chimpanzee called Noam Chomsky, obviously after Noam Chomsky, and he did the same thing. He worked with the monkey, lived with the monkey, the monkey, not a monkey, I'm sorry, it's a chimpanzee. There's a big difference. Chimpanzee's a primate, like a human. And Terrace did the whole thing, made the whole commitment, also filming and then transcribing from film. And Terrace published around 1980 his results. The community was really more inclined, I think, to accept that they had not shown that the animals were able to learn a human language, or able to learn grammatical rules to be able to consistently apply grammatical rules. So that was sort of the end of it for the gardeners, although the gardeners never sort of accepted that. And as a matter of fact, I mean, the truth of the matter is, it turned out, I won't go into problems with the various research, although let me step out of this for a sec. I used to work on this animal ethology stuff for a while. And the problem is that it's science. And so 2 things. One is, you spend a lot of time, if you get with these people, looking at the research, looking at the experiments, and trying to figure out how variables have not been controlled, or how there's some other reason why you can maybe show that the evidence isn't what it is, and so on. So it's just always picking apart these experiments. And then the other thing is, you have to commit to keeping up with the science, because there's all these new articles coming out all the time. And ultimately, that's why I couldn't really just keep on doing animal ethology at the pitch that I was doing it for about a year once, because it's science and you have to keep up with it. So if you want to do a science, you're committing to keeping up with all the research articles that come out all the time. And that's a big commitment. That's going to take up a whole bunch of your time. I had to realize that I wasn't one of these people who was super great at parsing experiments. I'm certainly not somebody who can go into a laboratory and build an experimental paradigm. I can't even glue two, chopsticks together. What I'm good is theoretical stuff, conceptual analysis. And so, but one of the things I learned by getting into the science of ethology for a while was that I figured out what my strengths were. Anyway, the reason I've stepped out anyway was just to talk about how keeping up with those articles is really a big deal. So later on, Terrace says he's not sure, and he has some regrets about coming down on the results of the gardeners as hard as he did. It's just not the case that the entire community ever just got together and said, okay, one thing's been shown decisively or not, as a matter of fact. It was just left. And that's unfortunate because, I think it was an excuse for people not to pay attention to something that they should have been paying more attention to. But after 1980, the research really goes in another direction. One of the things we've been talking a lot about in this course, our philosophy of mind class, is mental representation and whether or not representational theories of mind are the right kind of theories of mind. I'm going to talk to you about my own experience with that too in a second. But after the 80s, we see that sort of going beyond learning a grammar rule and getting into evidence for sort of mental causation, essentially, that there must be some mental content that's causing the behavior. And that's the only way to explain it. And then that's, an argument for the presence of content. So then the person who says, well, it's a non-linguistic animal, so they don't have any mental content, is put on the defensive at that point. So David Premack, who has a good book called Gavagai on animal language, had a chimpanzee named Sarah, and he worked with Sarah with colored plastic chips. So the plastic chips would come to represent things. Sarah, that is, would learn that you use the blue plastic triangle to ask for the apple, say. And so she learned how to do this. Now, of course, you can explain that with operant conditioning, training. The animal just comes to associate the blue plastic with the apple. But Premack worked with these also sort of storyboard things that had pictures on them, graphs on them, round things, red things, blue things, triangular things. Because Sarah eventually could also, if given a red apple, pick out the blue plastic triangle as well. She clearly had an associative conditioning between the two things, the apple and the blue plastic triangle. But what Premack showed was that the more details and the closer the details were to an apple, when you gave Sarah the blue plastic triangle, the more she would, be able to pick it out and say, yes, that's what this is associated with. It was evidence that the blue plastic triangle is causing Sarah to have some kind of, this is Premack's thesis, some kind of mental representation of an apple. Or even to put it in more neutral terms, the blue plastic triangle is playing a causal role in terms of her identifying an apple. So remember, the problem of mental causation is, the way we've looked at it before in this class, is it looks as if the contents of the propositions that are the contents of the beliefs and desires are playing a causal role that can't be explained in say, entirely neurophysiological terms. Well, what Premack showed, as far as a lot of people were concerned, was that it looked like there was an evidence for mental content playing that kind of role with the chimpanzee. Remember Searle's Chinese room. In the Chinese room, Searle shows that the computer is more like a rock than it is like a dog. The computer not only doesn't know what any of the symbols mean that it's manipulating with its rule-governed program. The computer doesn't even know what a symbol is. The computer doesn't even have a concept of representation at all. It doesn't have any concepts like that at all. So the chimpanzee then, Sarah's, David Premack's chimpanzee Sarah passes the test that Searle shows the rule-governed symbol manipulating system, the computational system, does not pass. That is, the computer might be able to associate the blue plastic triangle with the red apple, but it doesn't know anything about holding onto or biting onto blue plastic chips or juicy red apples. Doesn't even know their symbols. But Sarah does. When you give Sarah a blue plastic chip, she has somehow a representation, or if you're not sympathetic to representational theories of mind, some kind of causal effect around the apple. So David Premack then going beyond language and investigating mental causation. Remember, the cognitivists want to tell us that if you don't have grammar, then you can't have any mental causation at all. So all of this work with the primates is all pushing against cognitivism in that sense. I mean, they want to say on what cognitivism really holds, and I think they need to face it, is that they want to claim that there isn't anything in animals don't have any kind of mental representations whatsoever, because mental representations, remember, are grammatic linguistic objects to them. And so Premack's work, then you see, I hope, how Premack's work is pushing against that idea. Finally, then you get Sue Savage-Rumbaugh at the Yerkes Primate Research Center in Atlanta in the 80s, developing these large lexographic keyboards. I'll show you pictures of them in a second. They have large plastic keys that light up when you push it. They have abstract lexicograms or random lexicograms, and the chimpanzees choose which lexicograms they want to use for which objects. They name they name the objects themselves. Okay, so lexicograms are just random. They have no isomorphic similarity to what they represent. They're just ones that were chosen by the chimpanzees themselves. So, so the other nice thing about these lexicograms is, so they have these, you can hook them up to the computer. You have two lexicographic boards, one in one room and one in the other. When one chimpanzee hits the lexicographic button in one room, it lights that button up in the other room. So the chimps then, the chimpanzees, can learn to use these lexicographic boards, these lit up lexicographic boards, to communicate with each other. And what Savage-Rumbaugh showed was that her two chimpanzees, Sherman and Austin, were able to communicate in very complex ways. For example, one animal would be in one room and they would see the food placed in a certain container that had a certain kind of lock that needed a certain kind of tool to open it. And they would also note the kind of food that was in it. And they could tell their partner in the other room the kind of food that they were going to get, but also which kind of tool that they needed. Of course, that meant that they had the set of food and then the set of tool, and they understood the difference between the two sets, and then they understood all the members of the food set and the tool set. And they could solve all kinds of problems like this. They also liked people, at one point they were discovered, nobody had asked, that had trained them to do this, but when they were eating together, they would turn on the lexographic keyboard and they would take turns hitting the button for the food and then going and getting that food. And they liked to play that game. So they enjoyed playing with the lexographic keyboard and clearly using the different lexigraphs to either represent or somehow get in a causal relationship with these things. So great results with Sherman and Austin. This is what typically, again, one of these lexographic keyboards would look like. Originally, they were big, clunky electronic things where you had all the buttons on the front hooked up to the computer so that, I mean, Also, with these, you can control completely for cueing. You don't have any human beings around to prompt the animal with unconscious cueing. And you control for all other kinds of things. If you don't want the animal to smell peanut butter, you can have the animal in another room and so on. So this is what these lexigraphs look like. Later on, Kanzi's got one, a big printed versions that he can take outside. This is one of the original ones. There's one of Sherman and Austin using them. Again, that's kind of a clunky looking thing, but very good at collecting the data and controlling for the variables in terms of how the chimpanzees are using these symbols to communicate with each other. And they took to it, they like to do it, and they used it for all kinds of things. The Sherman and Austin were very good at it. There's also some interesting work on Sherman and Austin with video cameras, both video cameras of themselves and video cameras of people in other rooms doing things, and they also came to understand the video cameras really well. But Sue Savage Rumbaugh, after her work with Sherman and Austin, got Kanzi. Kanzi's very famous. Her main book of this research is called Kanzi. Kanzi was a bonobo chimpanzee. Bonobos are West African chimpanzees, I'm sorry, who are very smart. They're considered among the smartest chimpanzees. So, and Savage Rumbaugh was actually working with Kanzi's mother, trying to teach Kanzi's mother with the lexicograms, and Kanzi would reach out and hit the right lexigram, and Kanzi turned out to be really good. Kanzi's a little baby, he was just hanging on to his mother. And Kanzi indeed turned out to be extremely talented at this. In trials of 180 trials a time over 35 different kinds of objects to be identified, Kanzi scored over 95% on both lexicographic and spoken English cues. Another thing about animal behavior studies, you'll see that, well, the ducks, were able to solve the problem to 71% of the time. You think, okay, well, they're ducks, what the heck. But one thing you really want to check when you're looking at those statistics about how well or badly the animals do, how do human beings do on that test? Because human beings generally on these tests where they say, well, the aardvarks scored, 59%. Yeah, well, how did the human beings do? Well, 80%, that kind of stuff. Sometimes not that well. You might be surprised. So that's another thing you want to check when they tell you that the ducks can do it 74% of the time. Well, okay, but how well can the humans do it? All right. Now, Savage Rumbaugh, like Premack, wasn't really interested in whether or not Kanzi could learn grammar rules. She wasn't trying to get Kanzi to string lexicograms together. They did work in that area. But through her research and carefully recording, she did manage to show that there were some structures that Kanzi reflected in her use of the symbols. And I have them there on that last one. She tended to put the action before the noun. So if you said, go into the other room and get the ball, and she would go into the other room and get the ball, even if there was a ball in her room already. But if you said, get the ball that's in the other room, she'd have a hard time with that and tend to get the ball that was in the room where she was before going in the other direction. So that was something that was observed. She'd always go and hit the lexigram before making the gesture that was the equivalent of the lexigram, even when that was inconvenient to do so. So she seemed to think that that was very important. And she tended to put verbs in the order, come, eat, that kind of stuff. So very exciting results, really, with Kanzi. Really the thing about the animal, the work with primates or the chimpanzees. I know chimpanzees are really smart. So showing this kind of stuff with the chimpanzees isn't mind blowing to me. The other animals that I was looking at the time were seed catching chickadees. They could do some really amazing things. Here's Kanzi with her printed set that she could go outside with Sue Savage Rumbaugh in the grounds of the Primate Research Center there and walk around and do stuff. And finally, I want to look at the vervet monkey call work. This is in East Africa on the savannah. I think this is in Kenya, I'm pretty sure. And this is ground-dwelling vervet monkeys. They're small monkeys that live on the ground and in a big pack. And they are exposed to, for example, predators, a couple different kinds of predators, snakes, cats, and raptors. And so so Seyfarth and Cheney used technology that hadn't been around up until then. They would get the animals used to having speakers around in the bushes, and then they would have tape recordings of various kinds of vervet calls, and they would play them back to the vervets and see how the vervets reacted. Since then, this technology has been used, by the way, throughout animal ethology. I want to tell a story. I was hiking in the Monteverde cloud forest in Costa Rica one time, and I had shortly before then been in Guatemala, and no, it was in Costa Rica where I saw this, and I'd seen it. Well, anyway, I'd seen a quetzal bird, and quetzal birds have long tails and they're very spectacular looking, and it's really hard to see one. Lots of people don't see one. Lots of people who try to see them for years don't see one. And I just saw a quetzal bird, just clear as day. It was great. So I was all excited because I'd seen the quetzal bird already, and I was up in the cloud forest in Monteverde hiking on a little path up there, and I heard this bird call. It sounded like a real cool bird call. So I started to go through, I got off the path and I started to sort of walk through the bushes and see, where this bird call was coming from. And I came out into this little clearing, and there was a bunch of North American women, like 4 or 5 of them, bird watching types. And they had this tape recording, and they were playing this tape recording of some cool bird to see if they could attract it. Unfortunately for them, they didn't attract the cool bird. They only attracted me, and I came stomping out of the bushes. But anyway, that happened. So these vervets. So this vervet technology, and Seyfarth and Cheney, they showed also that the vervets were extremely sensitive to social relationships and family relationships to a degree that no one had ever realized before, just how fine-tuned they were to that. So they got a lot of results out of their work. But using this technology, the audio technology, then that quickly spread. And I think a lot of people in the public, I think the general public, is unaware that over just the last 20 or 30 years or so, the whole area of animal ethology, the thing is we previously, just because we didn't have very good ways of recording things and analyzing things, had no idea how complex animal behavior is. It's much, much more complicated than anybody ever used to think. So I think a lot of people still haven't sort of caught up with that. Oopsie, yeah, okay. Kanzi, vervets. Yeah, ground dwelling vervet monkeys, that's what they look like. Cute little suckers, nervous though. So yes, they have these very sophisticated, they're not exactly sonograms. I was looking for the word and I couldn't find it. Sonogram seems to be limited to looking at fetuses in utero, I guess, but somehow the other, whatever you call it. And what they uncovered, as I just said, was much richer semantic content that had been previously imagined, just much more complicated. So I just want to make some reflections. I do have opinions. I am an empiricist. I am sympathetic to, broadly speaking, operationalism. And I have some criticisms of cognitivism, particularly as it relates to animals. So as I said before, let me step out again just to say it another time. The boy and the dog are chasing the cat. They chase the cat over to the tree, and the cat goes running up in the tree. And the boy and the dog are down at the bottom of the tree, and they're looking up in the tree like this. They're looking for the cat up in the tree. And you say, what's going on? And I say, the boy and the dog think that the cat is in the tree. The boy and the dog believe that the cat is in the tree. Now, the question again is semantics, right? We don't have magic powers. We're just people, but we can think about words and what words mean. So when I say semantics, what are we referring to when I say the boy has thoughts, the dog has thoughts? Now, according to the cognitivist, The boy has the belief that, quote, the dog is in the tree, unquote, because the boy has grammatical capacity. The boy is a linguistic animal that can put together a linguistic object like a proposition. And that's what it means to say that the boy has a belief. He's got an attitude towards the proposition in language. That's the cognitivist view. And on that view, then the dog can't be said to have any beliefs at all. When I say that the dog also believes that the cat is up in the tree, I'm saying something completely different about the dog. And the dog's behavior, which is identical to the boy's, right? Absolutely, they're partners. Somehow isn't what it seems, or alternatively, I guess, when I say that the boy believes that the cat is up in the tree, I'm not getting that from the boy's behavior according to cognitivism. So I mean, there's some deep problems there. Because again, just to sum up the first point on that reflection slide, you know, it looks to me like it's just wrong to say that I don't mean the same thing when I say that the dog believes that the cat is up in the tree as I do when they say that the boy believes that the cat is up in the tree. Just looks like I mean the same thing. Okay, looks to me like that's the datum almost. Chomsky, who admits he's a Cartesian rationalist, I'm not calling him names. He's proud to be a Cartesian rationalist. Because remember, rationalism is kind of transcendental and does make this, you know, he doesn't want humans to be, as he sees it, dehumanized by being incorporated into the general naturalist regime. And that's where he and I disagree. So again, that second bullet point, they just don't think there are any mental representations in any non-linguistic animals. Linguistic aliens say, or if some species could be shown to have grammar rules, or I don't know, they can be satisfied. Their claim that thinking comes only with language is conceptually confused and empirically false. That's a pretty strong statement. Let me just talk about that a little bit. The thinking comes with language. Now, if they said you have to have language first, you had to have language and then you could think, that would obviously be wrong. Why would that be obviously wrong? Because there wouldn't be any way for language to evolve if you weren't thinking about stuff. But also, you've seen mice think, you know, I mean, thinking isn't something that's mysterious. So that, again, looks to me to be a huge problem. And Chomsky goes to great lengths at this at the time. I mean, he's more liberal minded, for example, about the phenomenal and conscious experience of non-human animals now than he used to be. But we're talking about Chomsky circa, Language and Mind from 1962 and, Rules and Representations from 1973, those kind of books. And then the last one, I mean, you know, people say, well, behaviorists just think people, people are zombies. Well, that's silly. No, they don't. And, so it seems to me that a lot of this whole discussion is really something that's generated by not having really the best grasp as to what behaviorism really is. I think it's sort of been a bit of a punching bag for too long. So people are sort of approach these things in kind of a partisan spirit and aren't really thinking about the stuff that they ought to be thinking about. Okay, that's that. Okay, so as I say, you can see my, but what is my opinion? If I say that animals have minds, is that kind of some kind of hippie thing for me to say? Or remember, in a different mood, I'll also tell you that I think humans don't have minds, because I'll say that this concept of mind is one that's just got problems, and especially to the extent that it's sort of metaphysically promiscuous in any way and not a sort of naturalistic concept that I'm not going to be sympathetic to it. But on the other hand, it does seem to me, like the man said, that in the case of many non-linguistic animals, just about any mammal I've ever encountered, you pretty much just look and see. Like with the dog looking at the cat up in the tree, you can pretty much look and see. I mean, the funny thing about these cognitivist arguments is they sort of suggest that what we see with our own eyes is some sort of illusion. The dog doesn't really love you. Or somebody said one time, they were reading an article in the paper and they looked up and said, hey, I said, look, the dog acts like it loves you, but the dog's only just evolved to act like it loves you because that's its survival strategy. So it's just, you know, as if this is an illusion. Listen, your baby, your infant acts like it loves you, you know, and yeah, it's a survival strategy for sure. Does that mean that it's not really love? No. See, that's the thing. As I say, you can look and you can see. You can see that your dog is afraid of something. Usually you can see that your dog loves you, usually. So, you know, don't forget the look and the see. And it seems to me that if the psychological theory and the look and the and what you look and see, as I'm with my man David Hume, don't match up, then you know it's probably your theory's got a problem. Because as someone else once said to me, you know, any 5-year-old can see that, you know, dogs and cats have minds, and yeah, I totally agree. So what's all the fuss? But again, we're in an argument here that this is a huge argument that many people have taken seriously for a really long time. It gets to this difference in psychology between innatism and learning models, between rationalism and empiricism in a very robust way. Okay, so anyway, that's that. And I'll see you next week. Look over these links. This is a very classic topic.